to Kurt, who I met in 2015, as I recall, maybe 2014. And at that time, I was a professor at Binghamton, and I had a grant to study religion and spirituality as practiced in the context of everyday life. Essentially, I was studying all the religious congregations in Binghamton, New York, from a multi-level evolutionary perspective, and in a very intellectual way. And one of the pastors with whom I was working said he wanted to do something on interspirituality. I had not heard that word, and wanted to invite Kurt Johnson. I had not heard of him either. And so that's how I met Kurt. And what I discovered was that there's a whole world that we're about to learn about, and for whom conscious evolution, the concept of consciously evolving our future, was a major theme and inspiration, but almost no connection with the hard science of evolution that I represented. And even though I studied religion and spirituality from a scientific perspective, I did not regard myself as certainly not a religious, and actually not even a spiritual person. But Kurt really had a foot in both worlds. Not only did he have a PhD in evolutionary biology like me, where he was a very, very distinguished insect systematist. He's described hundreds of species of butterflies, species and genera of butterflies. But also, while he was getting a PhD, he also became a clothed monk of the Episcopal order. And so as a person, he existed in both worlds. And within the world of interspirituality, he is one of the most amazingly connected people you'll ever know. And so we bonded instantly and have been together ever since. And I like to say that Kurt actually helped me to think of myself to be comfortable with thinking of myself as a spiritual person, as opposed to just studying it. So I have a profound debt to Kurt, and I'm so happy the prosocial world has spirituality as one of its major foci, along with its other foci, such as schools and youth and business and economics and so on. It has spirituality. And so we're truly knitting them together, those two worlds. And so, with apologies for being a bit long-winded, I'll now turn it over to my great friend, Kurt.
Making sure I'm not on mute. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you to this prosocial seminar that is officially entitled Interspirituality and Upshifting Global Prosocial Behavior. And it times out at about 40 minutes, so we should have plenty of time to also discuss. So I want to begin with some watchwords to kind of set the tone of this time that we'll be spending together, both from the head and from the heart. So first, from the heart, attributed to Aristotle, a true friend is someone who cares about the world.
Quickly, were you intending to show your slides yet, or are you going to?
They'll be coming up later.
Okay, fine, that's fine. Keep going. Sorry to go ahead.
A true friend is someone who cares about the world as much as you. And then, as to the intellectual part of our discussion, and to cut myself a little slack, as is attributed to Max Planck, but also to George Box and Norman Draper, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. Essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And then two basic definitions, interfaith and interspiritual, that will help us further anchor the discussion. So interfaith, pretty simple. If you have a peaceful discussion about the differing ideas and claims of religions, that's an interfaith discussion. But if you have a peaceful discussion about the values and ideals that they all share, love, kindness, reciprocity, mutuality, co-creation, and so on, that's interspirituality. And as David Sloan Wilson often quotes me as saying, the deepest spiritual experience in all of the traditions is that of realizing profound interconnection. and that realization of profound interconnection has a profound relationship to how we behave. And then also to add up front that the interfaith discussion about how to ameliorate all these problems of separation might be considered what's called a first-tier consciousness experience. But the interspiritual discussion that is based on profound interconnection might be considered a second-tier consciousness experience. And then for those new to prosocial, this define prosocial simply as the opposite of antisocial. So let me go now then to the short description of this program as it was posted at Prosocial World. So quote, interspirituality is part of the great intersubjective discussion that the world so desperately needs, but to a great extent has never had. Science is part of this discussion as to how reality is experienced, observed, and described. Prosocial is especially part of this discussion as its goal is to promulgate prosocial behavior. And behavior is greatly affected by the stories that we tell and accept. Brother Wayne Teasdale, my mentor and who mentored many, originated the word interspirituality, and he's famous for saying, the only viable religion for the third millennium is spirituality itself. And by that, he meant the deepest of subjective and objective experience that leads to prosocial behavior. So let's explore the challenges and assets that we share in navigating this directive. And I'll also say quite up front that this whole journey is also what Rian Eisler is speaking of with regard from moving our world from domination consciousness and behavior to partnership consciousness and behavior. So then to follow on that, from when this program was originally posted, which is almost a month ago, a big thanks to a recent discussions on the prosocial commons that actually ended up morphing this discussion further into one that is also about the challenges of movement building itself and what we and history have learned from the interfaith and interspiritual movements. Because much of this is all about how we are to create effective impact networks. So impact networks for prosocial change will also involve movement building. And of course, you don't build a movement, you somehow become a part of how it simply happens. And as you know, I and also Jeff Janung, who's the executive director of Prosocial World, both have major functions in this upcoming Igniting the Holo Movement event in Sedona, Arizona later this month. So what I'm going to be exploring here is also a lot about the challenges of movement building and how it involves to be successful and have impact navigating complex demographics and their differences, such that movement building can also fail simply because of the complex demographics of diverse constituencies and diverse worldviews. So in movement building, we don't want to become victims of demographics and end up failing because of the Murphy's laws of everything that can go potentially wrong with movement building, but potentially maybe we can do better. So what I want to do then is move to some illustrations about demographics. And among them, I'll be starting with some that are often illustrated at the beginning of many prosocial presentations regarding the challenge of knowledge archipelagos or knowledge silos and other kinds of silos, whatever we may call them. And I've just arbitrarily chosen to present demographics in these diagrams as pie slices, mostly because the lines between the pie slices can illustrate the boundaries that demographics inevitably have, especially regarding worldviews with regard to what's in and what's out. And of course, there could be many other ways that we could illustrate this. So with that, we will go to screen share. Hold on. All right. So here are demographics as pie slices. where the white lines would clearly indicate regarding constituencies and worldviews what is in and what is out. So in prosocial, we often talk about the knowledge archipelago or knowledge silos, but actually we also have silos of experiences. What people report that they are experiencing. And as I'll mention later, neuroscience is saying now this may depend on brainwave patterns regarding who has what kind of consciousness experience. And then we also have silos of explanations, because we may agree on the reality of an experience or on certain content, but we're going to have a different explanation of what causes it. And then there's the big one, our differences regarding what we think is real or not real. Wait here, hold on. And this is further than exacerbated by our ways of knowing, which I've summarized here just in two phrases: knowledge about and direct experience of. And sometimes this becomes knowledge about versus direct experience of. Now, you might want to think that you could further define these as objective and subjective knowing, or perhaps third person versus first person knowing, but I'm not sure that those work at every level of detail. But what I mean, and I mean it humorously, but I think it helps you get it, is to think of that first date that you have after you've met someone online. You have the knowledge about them, but then you have the direct experience of them. And they may be the same or they may not. And this situation might even be a deal breaker with regard to further connection. So that's the dynamic I'm talking about at the personal level. Now, to understand the same dynamic at the global level, perhaps what's best is the famous quote by Paul Hawken: "If you still have hope for the world, you haven't seen the data. But if you don't have hope for the world, you don't have a heart." So just to review those areas again, we have silos of knowledge, silos of experience, silos of explanations, and then the big one, differences about what is real or not. Likely that's the biggest potential deal breaker when it comes to cooperation. And somewhere down the line, probably in the next 5 decades, we're also going to approach another big one, which is going to be, is reality primarily based on material or primarily based on consciousness? And that's going to be a big one. So if you look at the diagram, you'll see that I began on the right to actually start to make it into a square, since in that context, you could construe it as the quadrants of integral theory or spiral dynamics, with the external elements on the right and the internal elements on the left, regarding what is real or not real, testable or detectable or not, or explained in this way or that way, and so on. Now, for instance, some people will say, I can't understand why anyone would be interested in integral or spiral dynamics. And well, obviously, unless you're really interested in the inner dimensions on the left, as one would inevitably be relative to the historicity of religions or spirituality or spiritual or subtle realm experiences themselves, you could just leave it all out, as much ado about nothing. And I'll say more about that later. So with that as a segue, and to move ahead, I want to talk about what our experience was in the decades leading up to the publication of the 9 points of agreement among the world's religions, developed in the 1990s and published in the Common Heart in 2006. And the 9 elements of the universal spirituality of Brother Wayne Teasdale, published in 1999. Now, the 9 elements, which are part of prosocial spirituality, simply ask, if we agree on the 9 points of agreement between the world's religions, what does that mean relative to how we behave? So you'll see that the pie slices over on the right, obviously in the sense of all the differences in the world of religions, are really challenging. And they were characterized by nearly complete disagreement about what was in and what was out in their worlds of theologies, truth claims, end time scenarios, and so on, but sharing nearly all the same basic values, at least as professed. And this kind of parallels also, you see at the bottom, the diversity of views in prosocial world, while all agreeing on prosocial behavior. So kind of like Steve Hayes did in his talk, I'm going to recount some life experiences that I think can give you a feeling for some of the extremes that were involved in this process with the world's religions. And so I actually have to start with the theologian Hans Küng saying at the time of the founding of the United Nations, there can be no peace among the nations until there is peace among the religions. Now, isn't that a paradox if the central values of all the religions are about peace, love, kindness, and so on? But what happens is, as Integral Spirituality points out, about 70% of the world's religions in the past, and even now, are in the magic mythic mode. My dog is better than your dog. There ain't room enough in this town for both of us. And so on. That perpetuates all the divisions. And you even see that today with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church supporting Zelensky and the Russian Orthodox Church supporting Putin. Yes, you teach love and kindness, but ethnocentrically, only for your own group. And so it gets perpetuated at the global level. Now, it also gets perpetuated at the personal level because, as Wilber and neuroscientist Alan Combs have pointed out, individuals may have the same vertical experience, but they immediately interpret it according to the horizontal axis of what they have been taught or already believe. And that's a complex model that's called the Wilber-Combs lattice, and perhaps has some applications to science as well that I'll mention later. So this perhaps helps explain the bizarre paradox of how some of the worst and some of the best things in world history have happened in the context of religion. So now I'm going to switch back to me before I go back to screen share so that you can actually just deal directly then with me. Okay. So I'm going to recount some of these personal examples, kind of like Steve did. Now, these incidents are over 20 years ago, and they also help show that then maybe we've made a little progress since that time. Now, in the deliberations toward the common heart, we were dealing with the representative of a religion that I won't name. He was actually the head of religious studies in that religion at a major university. And he informed us, and we were all friends, that we had to understand that if a jihad was declared, it would be his responsibility to make sure that we were all killed, and that he would take that responsibility because that was his duty. Now, on hearing that, the representative of one of the other religions there said, and addressed him by his first name, since we were all friends, and I'll call him just George, "Gosh, George, couldn't you just put yourself in our shoes for a moment? Doesn't what you said sound just a little bit arrogant?" And he replied, "Gentlemen, the truth is arrogant." Now, the reason I tell this story is also because back then and also now, I represent the humanist community at the United Nations. And at that time, the motto of the humanist community was, "It's not your God that I'm afraid of. What I am afraid of is what you will do in his name." And I recount that story because of that pronoun, his. That's 20 years ago, and hopefully we've even gotten a bit beyond that one. So the second example I want to give is about the papal encyclicals that first opened Vatican II in 1958, and then the later ones that closed it down. Moveless say by our better angels, Vatican II started what is called the foundationalist discussion among the world's religions about what they had in common. But as it developed exponentially, it became threatening. So a later papal encyclical shut it down. Now, what is important about that is that it illustrates again this division between acting from the head versus acting from the heart. Theologians mostly obeyed the encyclical shutting down Vatican II, but many contemplatives and social activists did not. So if you were fairly protected in a religious order, the discussions continued, as was the case with the Cistercians and the Trappists. And remember, that was Thomas Merton's order. So there the conversations continued, especially through Father Thomas Keating of the Trappists, and did result in the publication of the 9 Points Agreement, published in the Common Heart in 2006. So I want to end this little subsection about that experience just by telling you a bit more about the experience that we had with Father Keating, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Ken Wilber, and so many others in the decades that led up to the 9 Points of Agreement. Now, I was not able to attend all of the meetings, but Father Keating's tactic was always similar. Father Keating really set us up. He brought together all these leaders from across the world's religions, and he sat them down together in their robes and all the rest. And he said, if anyone can decide about what the world religions agree on, it's you. So get about the job. Well, what happened was we found out that we couldn't agree on much from the head or from theologies, certainly not among the theists versus the non-theists, or even when we were wordsmithing between words like oneness versus not two-ness. So to be honest, and this is very moving, after a couple days, because these were really all good people, everyone simply had a good cry. That's really what happened. Everybody ended up having a good cry. No one could agree easily on any of the head stuff, but we could all agree on love, kindness, compassion, reciprocity, mutuality, and so on. And that took the 9 Points of Agreement in a completely new direction. So it was actually vulnerability and just being human that led to those major interfaith accords, which also then morphed then into the 9 elements of universal spirituality that Prosocial uses. So I'm going to go back now to screen share. Whoops. I may have to adjust that a little bit. Hold on. Find the adjuster. There it is. All right. So science also has its ins and outs. And during my PhD, I was embroiled in the plate tectonics versus stable Earth debate, wherein for decades, those who have made themselves famous by explaining biogeography based on stable Earth made sure for decades that the biological data for continental drift was heresy and could not get in the door. And then suddenly in the geofields, especially geophysics, plate tectonics was confirmed. And so it suddenly went from heresy to having on your doctoral writings to be able to explain all the geo-based data sets that supported it. So at the Association for the Advancement of Science meetings in 1979 or 1980, that was pre-internet era, but it was the one that was at the University of North Dakota, there was a special session that was entitled Continental Drift Survivors, where all of those who has had their careers destroyed or who had had no career at all because they'd supported biological data sets for continental drift got to tell their horror stories. And one major journal even apologized for years of rejection notices. The other example back then was bird-dinosaur relationship. Again, now taken for granted, because what we know about the ornithischian dinosaurs, raptors and feathers, you've seen it all in Jurassic Park, not to mention NMRs that can be done on fossils and so on. But back then it was heresy. And the only job that its champion could get was at a little county museum in Wyoming. Another example is acoustic archaeology, which is now a field in itself. And I just checked it out at Google before I got on. It has 3,100,000 entries, but also a heresy until very recently. And I mentioned it specifically because it represents an overlap between science and spirituality or consciousness. As you may know, acoustic archaeology studies ancient sites like the Malta Hypogeum and many others, which are now understood to have been built to induce altered states of consciousness, especially in the context of, I guess, what we would call the shamanism of those times. And I'll say more about that later. And of course, in physics, we had the long debate prior to the mainstreaming of quantum mechanics, and then the bringing together of the string theories through M theory. That's actually a funny story, which I don't have time to tell, but there's a great documentary about it. And of course, we have David Sloan Wilson's and others' own voyage with group and multi-level selection. So it brings up another famous quote of Max Planck: "Science proceeds one funeral at a time." But anyway, not to overplay those cards, but just saying. Now, I want to take just a deeper peek at some of the nuances that are involved here, and some of them are actually quite challenging, especially in the sense that across the pie slices, we may agree on the reality of certain experiences or certain content, but we'll have a different explanation about them depending on what pie slice we come from. And in that context, it can be really intellectually frustrating, as you know. And this also creates deal breakers regarding cooperation, and also even has wider sociological consequences. So just a few of those for fun. And remembering Einstein's comment on the right, slightly out of context here, but useful nonetheless, regarding phenomenon that you just don't seem to be able to pin down, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. And this in the relationship of experiences, explanations, and their sociological consequences. So in the upper left, when I was in my PhD philosophy of science training, we were told what the spiritual traditions are telling you is there is a genie in my icebox. Believe me, he's really there. But the nature of the genie is that when you open the icebox, he will tend to disappear, so you can't test it. So this is all bunk, and you can just dismiss all of it. Again, the problem of spooky action at a distance, things that you just can't nail down. Now, the problem is the more that you delve into deep subjective experience, which a recent book even correlates with brainwave patterns, you either have some of these experiences or you don't. So let's take a look at just some examples, for instance, in the graphic in the field of medicine, with regard to therapeutic touch, or also Reiki and other similar modalities that are now medically licensed in many states and nations. Now, obviously it works when it works, but one pie slice would explain it by an account of some kind of spiritual energy, like from a wider Akashic field, while another pie slice would say, yes, it's real, but what you're actually doing is just creating an elaborate placebo effect, whatever that is. So moving then to shamanism at the bottom left, which now also has its own health, well-being, and healing modalities, same thing. Doing ceremony, beating a drum, which neurosciences now correlates with certain Hertz levels in the brain. and has a certain effect on entraining consciousness. You get these results, which again can be explained in different ways, either as a spiritual reality or as an elaborate placebo effect, whatever that is. Now, I have one shamanic friend whose name I'll keep confidential because he's really humble, who's revered for guiding people out of comas. And he's contacted by various hospitals where those staffs know that the results are real, and he's able to get let in as a clergy person. That's how he gets into the room. And interestingly, he's the successor to the main Native American leader who was a part of creating the 9 points of agreement in the common heart, grandfather Gerald Red Elk. Plant substances, for instance, now are well known for their consciousness changing experiences, and with a body of scientific work now, especially in trauma studies. And I have another colleague, a psychiatrist, who's working on a model to try to explain what it means when you ask a shaman, how do you know the medicinal benefits of a plant? And the shaman replies, the plants tell me. So regarding shamanism, there's some understanding today at personal level phenomenon, but I have to say, to be fair, if we went on now to weather shamanism, I think for many of us that would be a bridge too far. So this difficulty also appears to be the case in the objective realm as well. So speaking of spooky action at a distance, so bottom right is one of the UFOs or UAPs videoed by the Navy, and regarding which all the pilots and radar operators have now been interviewed ad nauseam, where you can't nail down what is going on when, as the wing commander of the Navy pilot said, these things just speed away at fantastic speeds and disappear. So here you have a situation internationally, and I'm going to link it in a moment to conversations in the UN that you might not be aware of, where even a short list would be impressive regarding why this is real and needs to be addressed, as in the recent Department of Defense report and in a NASA report of just 2 weeks ago. That's simply because whatever these things are, they display capabilities completely beyond anything we know about, that they need to be taken seriously. And that view has been confirmed by presidents, CIA directors, and congresspeople, to name only a few: Reid, Rubio, Warner, Obama, Brennan, Clapper, Hayden, the heads of defense in Canada, Israel, and a longer list of nations, and about which they have classified briefings, but again, don't seem to be able to nail anything down, or at least anything that they will share. Spooky action at a distance when these things just happen and disappear. And yet, oddly enough, most people and most media, including a very famous New York City colleague of mine, appear to just edit it all out and say there's nothing here to see. So maybe again, that's the Wilbur-Combs lattice at work. It's a good question. But here's the real point, and again, it's about the sociological consequences with regard to the pie slices. If you listen to the First Peoples caucuses at the United Nations, and First Peoples would be an interspiritual issue, or at UNESCO's Heritage and Sacred Sites Council, they are saying, hey, if this conversation about UFOs and UAPs ends up only in the hands of the military and the technology community, it's bound to be approached only as us and them, or worse, us versus them. And that brings up the inevitable question, do we have the capabilities to destroy whatever these phenomena are, or kill whatever it is? So what happens then, you have First People saying at the UN and elsewhere, hey, according to our cosmologies, and these would be the First Peoples that claim star lineages, these might actually be our ancestors, whereas the military's first concern is going to be, how can we kill them? So this is an international discussion that you may not know about, but it's a big concern among First Peoples worldwide. Some who also, to be honest, claim to be in contact with these folks. That's a whole nother story. But of course, it can also just be ignored and dismissed. So on this subject, this little subsection is going to conclude on a humorous note. And that is that if you've seen the sci-fi film War of the Gargantuas, made 60 years ago, it's the same thing. So these things come down from outer space, and in the plot, the heartful scientists say we want to study them, but the military generals say we have to kill them. So laughably, there's nothing new here, but it is very interesting backwaters regarding pie slices, silos, and archipelagos. So this brings up then how to look at all of this. And for this, I'm going to share Dr. Ed Gibney's illustration. He's a core member of the philosophy group here at Prosocial, which he posted at the Prosocial Commons. And I think that it's a really constructive approach. And it also fits what many of us call the Mr. Fix-It model, which is, if you know the Mr. Fix-It motto, it is for every problem, use the right tool. So you'll see that what Ed has done is he has on the right, he has science, and he has the caption, science. We build all knowledge by collectively examining all and only things we can detect. And then he has on the left, mysticism, with the caption, mysticism, we can know about realms we cannot detect, and we can guide our lives from that knowledge. And then he places spirituality, really joining or overlapping them with the caption, spirituality, practices devoted to reverence and aid of things bigger than ourselves. Now, I'm not sure any of us could do much better. So thanks to Ed for that, unless someone really wanted to try to roll out a much more complex model. We're almost done. All right, so here again are pie slices, but pie slices that can actually serve us, especially in our agreement about prosocial behavior, and that original quote attributed to Aristotle, a true friend is someone who cares about the world as much as you. So here, instead of pie slices that are at odds with each other, these are pie slices that are portraying areas of global concern, where the demographics are simply differences in area of passion or engagement, but all in the context of shared commitment to upshifting global prosocial behavior. And you can just read them. We would agree on all of them. This is a diagram by Brian Russo at Rainbow Circle, who's a promising young leader for the future. And as you can see, he's parsed them out further to their relationship to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So not only then are these affirmations or goals, they're actually things trying to happen on the ground at a worldwide level. And then just to mention that two of the Prosocial Commons groups from the evolutionary leaders are from the SDG Thought Leaders, which it's sdgthoughtleaders.org, where we have over 100 thought leader participants, and also an official thematic cluster of UN NGOs. And that thematic cluster is based on a unitive consciousness or profound interconnectedness theme. So this would be the bright side of pie slices, or the demographic dilemma of how we can all work together for these shared high ideals and goals, no matter what pie slice we come from or combinations thereof regarding our worldview or experience. And to do that, we're going to have numerous thresholds to cross in this movement building from me to we. That comes next. So this is the next to the last slide, and it's actually to further this part of the discussion about movement building, which of course prosocial is a part of that phenomenon, and which is becoming a huge emergent phenomenon all around the world at this time. And of course, the prosocial principles exist and aim to address this. So I actually wanted to present this example just so that I'd be providing some specifics. And this is the one that one network, the one doing the March event in Sedona, have decided are its goals and modalities. Now you'll see that its many areas of engagement are in a halo around the major circle. So ecology, science, arts, justice, education, that whole list, those are the synergy circles in the ELs, just like Prosocial has its many small groups. And then you'll see in the middle, because impact is the goal, because we're all trying to become effective impact networks, impact is in the middle. And then you'll see that they've selected 4 key action areas that they feel can effectuate and achieve those goals. And the way that they've defined those are vision, which would actually really compare to prosocial principle number 1, which would be the purpose, unit of consciousness, and design. So then engagement, which is partners, membership, and the benefits of being a part of this network. Technology, which is web presence, social connectivity, and innovation. And then visibility, media outreach, and shared initiatives. And that's huge. So wish us luck. And I want to give another big thank you to Jeff Janung, who's executive director of Prosocial World, because he has a big and creative part of this gathering. So now to the last picture. So the challenges of movement building have certain characteristics. And like the 9 elements of a universal spirituality, these characteristics show both the directions and the eventual fruits. Co-working, co-branding, cooperating more than competing, check your egos at the door, look to the future, not the past, move from grievances to love, and move forward in partnership and hope. And further, the challenges of movement building also need certain understandings in order to keep us patient. Unfortunately, some of them are humorous. One that you may have noticed in your own group work is called Myth of the Given by Ken Wilber, and that is that naturally and likely, I think you noticed, everyone will think that their idea is best and that their brand name is the one that should be used. And this is often called the common cold of group work. But the grand aim, as Prosocial also says, is to find out if co-working and group co-creative consciousness can be exhilarating, even quite a spiritual experience. So to summarize, using the motto of Prosocial, there is grandeur in this view of life, and in fact, in many views of life. So to conclude, and then back to the pie slices in the bottom right, is it going to be pie in the sky or pie on earth? That's the question. We all have a big mandate ahead of us. Let's hope that we can live up to that quotation attributed to Aristotle: a true friend is one who cares about the world as much as you. So thank you.
So thanks to you, Kurt. Thank you so much. Of course, there's so much food for thought here. And so the custom is, please, if you want to join the conversation, then please raise your virtual hand, and that will automatically form a queue. And my policy is I'm always the 4th to speak, never the 1st. And so much I want to say, but please, and don't be shy. Nobody is disqualified to join this conversation. I think that's very much inherent in what Kurt was saying. So let's get going here. Jeff, what a perfect person to begin the conversation.
Well, thank you, Kurt. It's really great to have you here. And I watched a video that you interviewed one of your authors, Paul Mills, of a recent book. I think it's A Science of Being and Becoming, about the spiritual lives of scientists. And I found it really an amazing discussion. I bought the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. Because what he's kind of uncovered in these experiences of, hardcore scientists, many of which were skeptics, but then something happened in the realm of their own personal experience that changed perspective. And it seems to me it speaks to the heart of so many of the things that you're speaking to today, and also how it kind of plays into this kind of leading edge of, what I would call evolutionary spirituality, which is interspirituality. So I wonder if you could say a few words about what was uncovered in that book and how that relates to this topic. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say two things. What's less important about any kind of spiritual experience is the special effects. What's most important about any spiritual experience is the effect on the heart and behavior. Very often the two will visit together. But in Paul Mills's book, which I really on purpose haven't shared that much in the Prosocial Commons, because Paul really kind of takes it, he really interviews 32, well-known neuroscientists who had dramatic life-changing experiences by some type of experience, all the way from even a spiritual experience to even a trauma experience that transformed their lives. But the point is, that when those things occur, the real effect should be on the kind of person that one becomes: loving, caring, open, welcoming, and so on. And then along with that, many bells and whistles can show up. Some of the accounts, the one guy who's so well known, who was a scholar of non-normal experience but didn't believe in them, and therefore he felt he could really be a good scholar. And then he had this mind-blowing experience out of the blue. So I guess maybe all one can say is that, we just need to be ready in our lives for whatever might occur. It's the same with falling in love. You never know when you're going to come around the corner and then you're going to see that person. Or if you know the song by the Grateful Dead, Box of Rain, it's around the corner waiting for you. And you may never know when you go around the corner and meet it. So life's exciting in that way. And so Paul Mills's book is full of stuff like that. He's the head of integrative medicine at the University of California, San Diego. But anyway, not to go on more about that, but it's an eye-opening book. But it's also a challenging book for people who don't necessarily know much about that domain.
Joe.
Oh, I'm up. All right. Well, if I can quote Lenin and Trotsky to you, Kurt, whom? And my point is that everyone in the current system of our 8 billion people, someone benefits from status quo. And if you are perceived as a threat to status quo, they will not necessarily embrace you prosocially. And I think I'm trying to bring, I don't want to say cold water, but what we're up against, okay? Or could be in some circumstances. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. And even in putting this together, I had to decide, how far do I want to go, and putting certain cards on the table. So I made some limited references, but absolutely, paradigm shifts are difficult, no matter what domain we're in, whether it's in hard science or in the world's religions. Those paradigm shifts have been really difficult. And sometimes they've involved a lot of conflict or even violence. I think the question for us at a global level now, maybe there are other planets out there that have had to go through the same experience. How can we get to a cosmopolitan, pro-socially caring global community when we're rooted in all of these differences of language and color and cultural roots and beliefs? And also our species has a very short lifespan. To be able to grow and learn and become a giving person very often doesn't happen until people are maybe even in their 50s or 60s. So it's very difficult for this particular planet Earth.
Right. Thank you. Who's next? I have one more person who needs to speak before I do.
I had a question. I
Yes, please.
can't find my raise the hand icon. So hopefully I can just speak up. Is that okay?
Sure.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kurt, for giving a very interesting presentation. There was one slide, and actually a slide even earlier than that, where I think you were trying to communicate that everyone has this in common. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but one that stuck out to me on the third slide from the last one was equality. And I guess first I would need you to clarify, do you mean that everyone values, all those things on the wheel? And then I thought, like, equality certainly isn't something that I see everyone values. I see very large groups of people who have all kinds of rationalizations as to why things should not be equal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what they always say is whenever there's a trauma, people either, and either the world too, people either run toward unity or they run toward division. They're going to run to where they see safety. So you're absolutely right. Some people are going to see safety in trying to get toward the unity where the world that works for all and where everyone could be served. There are other people, because they're very wounded, their life experience, whatever it would be, the only place they see safety is in division and circling the wagons around their ethnocentric group or around their brand. That's true personally. It's also true globally. It's a dharmic principle when people are going through personal transformation. So that does create that difference where probably everybody who really believes that safety is in the world that would work for all, then they would embrace all of those pie slices and all of those values that one would be shooting for and that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are shooting for. But obviously, especially as long as our governments are investing in narcissistic leaders and we're producing autocracies that are run by very sick people, and yet they have absolute control. Right now, it would be at least half of the human population are in those types of societies. They have no options in those closed societies. So the question of where our planet will go, given that dynamic, like you just said, of who can embrace those universal goals and to whom those goals are extremely threatening, that is another really difficult question.
Okay, so there's two kind of big issues that I want to raise, Kurt, and so I'll begin with one of them. And so often, it's so common for all of us to think about religion and spirituality as paradoxical, because on the one hand, it's counseling love and prosociality in all its forms, and on the other hand, it's responsible for so much hatred and all of that. And I think that one of the great insights of multi-level selection is to provide a different perspective on that, and to show that really, this us versus them distinction is a feature, not a bug. It's exactly what is expected from a multi-level evolutionary perspective, and that always a worldview, any worldview, even if it appears religious or not, is serving the interests of a group of people and delineating that group of people from other groups, and is not inevitably hostile towards other groups, but basically does establish a different set of rules for how to behave as a member of an in-group and how to behave towards other groups. And just as with biological species, those between group interactions are indeed often hostile, and we should expect nothing else from any group on Earth in the historical past, not indigenous groups, not ancient groups, not modern groups. And I think that if you look, for example, at what's called the axial age by historians and the current research that's on it, what we find, and this is work by people like Peter Turchin and Ed Slingerland, that what these represents are new religions that provide a social glue at a larger scale than ever before in history, now uniting tens and even hundreds of millions of people, but always in competition at a still larger scale, always in competition at a still larger scale. You could look at Buddhism that way, Christianity, every case. And against that background, the idea of universal cooperation, the idea that the whole earth can be a cooperative unit was, I want to say, and I want to pose it to you to see if you agree, and to all of us, was beyond the human imagination until like 200 or 300 years ago. I'm told that the first faith that was truly universal, all nations, all creeds, was the Baha'i faith. That's mid-19th century in what was then Persia. And so now, since the future does not predict the past, now because globalization has proceeded, much as Teilhard de Chardin said that it would, now it's the only thing that makes sense. And it's the only thing that makes sense to everybody. So now you get his Dalai Lama saying, beyond religion, an ethics towards the whole earth. He says again and again, there's, 7 billion people on this earth and they'll never all have one religion. You have our common home, which is really on behalf of the whole earth. Now we have so many people, both religious and non-religious, it only makes sense to regard ourselves as first and foremost human beings and citizens of the world. And all of the different faiths, secular or religion, are now trying to retrofit themselves. And so it's a case of mismatch, basically evolution, cultural evolution that is taking place only now. But it seems to me that rather than seeing this as a paradox, both the best and the worst of religion as a paradox, there's so much more clarity in seeing it for what it is, which is cooperation at subglobal scales, which is the only form of cooperation there ever was. And now we need to make it global. So that was a bit long, but interested in anyone's reflections on that.
And actually, I was saying that in the context that Ken Wilber says that we have to understand why that has been paradoxical, and then we have to get beyond that. I want to say we got about 4 other major experts in the room here on this. Diane Burke is an expert on this. Bob Atkinson is, John Clausen from Findhorn. And just, I'd love to hear from them, but just to say that, what integral spirituality says is that it's not anything about the ideas of a religion, it's the behavioral level of the religion. That's the litmus test. That's the same, I think, with prosocial. So Rumi, which is all about love, is Islam, but ISIS, that cuts off heads, is also Islam. And Mother Teresa, loving and taking care of everybody, that's Christianity, and so was the Inquisition. But the question is, are we going to move toward the highest developmental levels for behavior that are possible given the real aspirations of all of those elements that ended up being in the common heart and are certainly in the 9 points of agreement? So, Diane and Bob and John chime in on that, because we just absolutely agree with you, David. This is possible. It's possible to go beyond that mire of those lower developmental levels where everything is set off against something else. It's the only hope for the planet, is to get to that higher level of behavior. Anyway, so people.
Great. I have 2 more people, and thankfully some women. Thank you so much. Marcia, and then Kate, and then let's have some more people before I make my next point. I think there's a lot of substance here, of course, to discuss. So Marcia.
I'd like to introduce an idea that has just come to me watching a very well-known Episcopalian Christian spiritual teacher come forth saying that this has to start in the body as well as the mind and as the spirit, and that Christianity denied the body entirely as it was evolving. And I just wondered if anybody else is thinking about that we need to look into, and Kurt, you've used the word, how is the person behaving? To my mind, that means, what is their body doing? How is it moving? What is it feeling? And I'm really, and part of this comes out of my study of trauma and how that becomes embodied until released is controlling. I just wondered if anybody else has thought about that. I was just stunned to
Yeah,
hear
I
somebody
can
coming.
refer you to a website that will just light your fire on that. Go to presence.tv, which is
Okay.
presence.tv, Conversation for a New Earth. This is all Christians who are thinking that Christology is not about a ticket to heaven. Christology is about transformative behavior and moving from being caught in forms, caught in the types of inevitable, demographics that David was talking about, and getting outside of the traction of forms and being free of those and being able to be free to be welcoming and loving and caring at a global level, no matter what your bottom line worldview would be. It's based, to a lot degree on integral and spiral dynamics, but the guy that runs it is the son of Max King, who only died about a week ago, who was actually the first Christian evangelical to get kicked out of the evangelicals for saying, hey, this is not about a ticket to heaven. This is, because there may not even be a heaven. This is about how we go beyond our being captured by forms, and we become free of those forms to really be loving, caring people across all demographics of color and backgrounds and all that. So that's out there. It's out there in a big way. And I think that's what Prosocial is about. I think that's where we have this connection with Prosocial. And actually, two of the authors of Prosocial Spirituality are in the room, Diane Burke and Jeff Janone.
Great, and Kate Sheehan.
Is Kate here also? I didn't see her.
She's up next. She's up
Maybe
next.
she's on page 2 and I hadn't gone to page 2.
She's up next. Go ahead,
Okay.
Kate.
Yeah, Kate also.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurt. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Thank you for your brilliant bridge building and for being that bridge for so many. And thank you, David, for creating this forum and for what you shared about that these appearances of the world's religions, really, really important perspectives, along with Diane Burke and Jeff Janone, and inspired by Kurt Johnson. I've been working with Prosocial World to actually study this, to actually look at this dynamic between science and spirituality, looking at how spiritual groups make sense of Lynn Ostrom's core design principles and Wayne Teasdale's interspiritual elements. So that's the nutshell of where it begins. But the really interesting unfolding is when we look at small groups. That is what the multi-level look at this is, looking at small groups. And I just want to share 3 insights that we have thus far in this 3-year research initiative. One is inspired by Father Thomas Keating, who Kurt talked about, whose latest book just came out posthumously. I got this in the mail today. God is All in All. Want to talk about an outlier. He's still publishing from beyond. But one thing Thomas said was there are as many religions on planet Earth at any given moment as there are human beings on planet Earth. And with that perspective, we can very much break free of this tribalism that we're pointing to. So from that approach, in prosocial spirituality, we're asking groups to come together and just experiment with us. Try these things on for size, see what happens. And we're gathering data as we go. What I'm seeing so far is that just the 3 things I'd like to point to is one is working with groups that come to us through the United Religions Initiative. If you're not familiar with URI, it's an amazing initiative where it's a grassroots global network, but truly grassroots in that it's small groups that their only requirement is that they must have at least 7 members and they must represent at least 3 different world religions or non-religions. So they're intentionally diversified. So when I'm working with these groups, I'm experiencing much greater openness. So right there, I'll just pause on that. The other thing I'm noticing is people under 30 are functioning at a level of acceptance higher than I've seen. This evolution toward acceptance allows for an openness. And the other factor is the crisis mentality of our day. I'm a historian by training, so I see crisis throughout the course of time. I'm primed for what we're looking at here today. But crisis mentality tends to break down those walls as well. So we're studying it, we're looking at it, but I want to acknowledge that we're in one of those little petri dishes right here, right at this moment. The more we come together and discuss and listen, the more.
Yeah, no, I just want to give a quick comment before we move on. Remember the Mr. Fix-It motto, and this makes it really real. For every problem, use the right tool. You may not have made the connection, but the good cry that Thomas Keating led us all to, that's where we changed the tool. And once we all had that good cry, then what rolled out was the 9 points of agreement. It couldn't have ever come from up here. It came from people
The
really,
body.
yeah, it came from people feeling bankrupt in the world of ideas when they were all deeply caring people. So yeah.
And beautiful, Marcia, thank you for bringing it back to the
Yeah.
body. We do some embodiment practices, and thank you for pointing to that as definitely the feminine model, the receptive model. So thanks for letting me share, and stay tuned.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
And
Thank you.
I think that this event, both the people that are right here and other people that are hearing it should act as a funnel towards prosocial spirituality. And if anything, if you're inspired by this to do anything, especially in groups, then please see Kate and the rest of us at Prosocial Spirituality, and we could be doing. And I think, Kurt, I loved that how you said it all comes down to how do we behave. So David, and then Liano, and then Diane. Then I'm going to put myself in.
Okay, I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. I have problems with my video, so I have to have a phone and this. So sorry if you're getting a little feedback. It's a simple question, Kurt. So I think there's a relationship. One of the last slides you had at the center of the circle, the goal was, or the outcome was impact, right? We're all trying to create the greatest impact. If you change that to oneness, and if we practice oneness to become one, so for example, Erwin Laszlo, the macro shift is to holos, right?
Yeah, we're just publishing his book. It just went to press yesterday. Proof, the latest revision of the cover tonight. Yeah, so his new book, The Survival Imperative, Upshifting to Conscious Evolution, April 24th, from the press that Bob and I run.
Great. So I just wondered, I wanted to insert that oneness, because I think the more we begin to understand that that's the key, I think the closer we get to the end result that we want. And that's the evolutionary transition. And
yeah,
that's
you're absolutely right. And so the group that is responsible for that diagram, they are oneness on steroids. And that's why they're concerned about impact, because their fear is that if we can't garner a large portion of our globe to have that kind of awareness, which is the same as prosocial awareness, then we may not make it. Or as David says, we may not go extinct, but we're going to be in for some miserable time. So this thing about impact, we work with Google Impact Networks with regard to this event. Everyone who's on the side of where we're trying to go, like you say, with oneness, prosocial consciousness, we just have to make that impact before the world would go somewhere else. I'll quote David Sloan Wilson on that evolution may take you somewhere where you didn't want to go, but by then it's too late.
Right. Okay, all great. Liano, and then Diane.
Okay. You keep saying for every problem use the right tool. And I think that in this discussion and in the social sciences more generally, I think we're using kind of the wrong notation, like and we're focusing on the wrong kinds of things. Like we're focusing on things like you know, whether somebody is loving or whether somebody is something else or whatever. And I think the key thing that we're missing is the meso level here that we're missing is that all of these things are products of stories, and those stories have their own evolution. They're not here to serve us. They're here to reproduce themselves in our brains. And I think that we need to be analyzing these things on the level of what is the story that's being told, and what is the narrative structure of that story, and how is that narrative structure morally coded. And I think that a lot of our conversations would be a lot clearer if we did that, and then we could also break them down into things like what we're talking about here.
And here's how we can get to that. And I know you from the Prosocial Commons, so I know that you're really deeply involved in the political side of this, which is really important. So when we're talking about love or those types of ideals, those are a state. But states, as you just said, are not meaningful until they become a structure where they become a caring community or a caring society, not just an isolated, loving individual. It's one of the really great messages of integral and spiral dynamics is, and we saw it in the failure of Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, where you have a state that says, oh, it should be this way, but you don't stick around long enough to build a new structure that actually reflects that. And that's the part that's difficult. See, that's what's amazing about what David and everyone's doing with Prosocial. They have their construct, but they're saying, hey, not enough just to experience this as a state. We have to actually build the social structures that reflect these values at that level, which is that meso level or that meta level that you're talking about. So absolutely, yeah.
Right. All great conversation. Diane, so nice to hear you.
So nice to be here. So great to see you, Kurt, too.
We only go back about 30 years.
It feels like it. Yeah. What I find myself thinking about, your last comment, Kurt, is really interesting to me because the movement from state to structure is not simply external. It's not simply from an individual to a collective. It's also an internal movement from a state of consciousness to the integration of that state of consciousness so that that's really where you live your life from. And, you know, I've been reflecting during this conversation on the goal of kind of increasing prosocial behavior. And I think that there are two ways of doing that. One is what Wayne Teasdale describes when he talks about ethical codes, when he talks about the first of the 9 elements. And he says every religion has a code of ethics. And those codes serve as training wheels on the bicycle until people are actually established in a consciousness of love and unity. Their behavior is going to be pulled both in egoic directions and in unitive or prosocial directions. So these codes of ethics, kind of like training wheels on a bicycle, keep you upright while you're learning how to maintain your balance, how to actually do that. And so I think that part of the way I understand prosocial spirituality is how do we encourage prosocial behavior while people are maturing to a state of consciousness where there's very little possibility of anything other than prosocial behavior. But as Wayne would say, that's a very long road. And as you said, Kurt, most of us are not going to get there in a single human lifetime. So I see it as, but that we want to encourage both. We want to encourage the individual evolution of consciousness so that prosocial behavior is simply the natural expression of how you perceive and experience life in the world. The other thing that I just wanted to throw out is in terms of, well, I'm not even sure where this fits, but I found myself thinking about Ken Wilber's definition of healthy development, that healthy development is always transcend and include. And so it's not that the ideal is to not have any tribal identity, to not have any particularity of identity, whether it's religious or ethnic or national, whatever, but that is only a part of what then becomes a primary identity, which is more expansive and inclusive. So my identification as a human being doesn't preclude that I'm American, that I live in a white body, that I was born into a Jewish family. All of those are included, but until you reach that transcendent level, anything other than those particularities, anything that challenges those particularities as the be all and end all, is going to be experienced as threatening. But I think part of the fear, let's say, around globalization that we see is that we're much more used to thinking in terms of transcend and deny. And so there's a fear that the more particular identities are just going to be wiped out and annihilated unless they're seen as the be all and end all.
Yeah, and there are examples of where we could all come up with. I think of Haile Selassie pointing out that we don't fight over eye color anymore. We got past that one. We got all kinds of eye colors, no matter what the skin color may be. So yeah, and if you think of even smoking back now so many people just won't smoke because it's in their consciousness that this isn't healthy, or they don't even want to be around it. Whereas if you watch the golden oldies on TV from the 50s, everybody was even a sexual mark to have a cigarette in your mouth. So yeah, we do get there. But the question, this big question of how we would get there at the level of global behavior, a friend of ours, Claudia Wells at ION, says, if I ever met people from a planet who made it, that's the question I'd ask them. How did you get by that threshold at the global level? Yeah. But we're on to that. That's the prophetic voice. That's what Wayne Teasdale element number 9, the prophetic voice.
Okay, well, so great, very rich, and I'm so happy to be having this conversation and to be having a ongoing conversation that we could refresh again and again. So Kurt, you presented all these pie diagrams, and I want all of us to imagine a circle. So it's like that. And the circle is naturalism, basically, the current boundary of science. And it has a center and an edge. If you look at the center of this naturalism circle, then what you find are things that nobody disputes. The statement that mountains existed before people, continental drift now has made it to that inner circle. These are now the mundane facts of life. And on the edge, there's the things that are contested, basically, as to be not scientifically real at all. But of course, that's a movable boundary. So it might well be that something which is on one side of that circle or the outside of that circle can get to be on the inside once we learn more. That's always a possibility. And it's not a possibility that I deny. So when you look at all of the fringe topics that you listed, I would place them, I would not deny their existence. I would just place them on the edge of the circle in contrast to continental drift, which is in the middle of the circle. Nobody's going to contest that one anymore. And the reason that I make this point and try to sketch this image in your mind is that if you look at the basic tools of prosocial world, what you find is that they're at the dead center of the circle. Elinor Ostrom's core design principles are, nobody's going to contest them. The idea that you need to monitor, that you need a strong sense of identity and purpose, and also this inner and outer, the fact that everything that evolves has, and this is where Marcia is coming in, that this has to be embodied. We just can't think about this intellectually. We have to actually feel this emotionally. So the idea that we have this whole inner dimension that we need to work on, in addition to the outer sociological dimension, that's also dead center, or at least it can be dead center. And so one of the things that worries me a little bit is that there's so much work that needs to be done at the center of the circle with facts that are uncontested. The fact that Elinor Ostrom's core design principles are uncontested doesn't mean that everyone knows about them or implements them. And so I sometimes talk about this as like gold underneath our feet. We don't have to go to the edge in order to find gold. The gold is underneath our feet. We need to work with uncontested facts are so important in terms of understanding them and configuring them the right way in order to make our groups work better, and also in order for us to be more fulfilled as individuals. And one thing that worries me a little bit is that as we move to the edge, then I feel that although I'm not arguing against it at all, but I do feel in some ways it's a distraction. That as we think about the edge, we're no longer paying attention to the center, and so much work needs to be done at the center that I just wanted to make the distinction, and I think to do so is helpful for me. That if you want to, for example, entertain the possibility of UFOs, be my guest. I'm not saying they don't exist, but let's not have that distract us, for example, from Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, just to pick. That would be a shame. That would be a real shame. So interested in everyone's thoughts on that. Kurt, why don't you respond to that? And then Victoria, thank you.
No, I totally agree. And some of it may be different callings. As you were talking, I was thinking about bell curves, and of course, what's going on at the mean, and then what's going on the two margins on the side. And so some people are called toward pushing the innovation at those margins toward then becoming the new mean. But yet there's so much that needs to be done about the healthy mean itself. I mean, you're absolutely right. And it may be a matter of kind of what different people are doing in that larger bell curve. So I don't see anything as a distraction, actually, because we're always in this, there's always going to be this dynamism of what's growing at the edge. My career's always kind of been there. That's how I got, dismissed from Holy Cross. Was when I was dismissed, it was pretty simple. Was, Kurt, we love you, but you don't stand for what we stand for. We stand for one brand, and you're out there talking about lots of different brands. So you don't belong here. And that wouldn't happen today. That was 40 years ago. But yeah, so yeah, I think, thank goodness that there are people that are called about the gold at your feet, which is right there, absolutely. And then there are people who are called to be fishing at the margins for where those next things that may move toward the mean are. So that's what I was thinking about, was population genetics and means and margins.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And we are going to respect our time here. And so it looks like, Victoria, you might just have the last word, or Kurt will, but you'll be the last penultimate person.
Well, I don't want to have the last word, but I just wanted to reflect a little bit on what Diane was saying in terms of that it seems that we've been trying to fix the person that we are. We've tried to fix this for a long, long time. You know, the shoulds, the 10 commandments. We've had a lot of information. We've had a lot of people give us a lot of good information in fixing the person. So I think that that question of identity is really a very big question, because it seems though, although we're trying to fix a person, in terms of the essential values, there's agreement on that. So what is that? What is that agreement on essential values? Why does that live in us? What is keeping that from being in the forefront rather than in the background? You know, like we know when we do something that we don't like. And nobody knows that more than people in the spiritual path. I mean, we've dedicated our life to that. And we still have that situations that go on like that because we've been so trained like that, conditioned. Everybody knows this. But I feel that the look is to, somebody said, the challenge of identity, the identification as a human being. You know, that is, to me, that is a huge, huge question. Because what if those values are inherent in us, which seems to be with what you're saying, and the religions have them in there, but something happened on the way to the forum, you know, something happened and we're just taken over by, you know, writing some children's books, taken over by a fog. It's a fog that's come over us. And the fog makes us, has many things, everything that we study, all the personality things, all the programs, all the self-help books are about fixing this thing that we seem to be. And there's so much blame on us, honestly. You know, I wouldn't want to tell a 5-year-old that they've destroyed the atmosphere and as a species. So I just feel like that that sense of leading to pro-social behavior. It seems like we kind of know that inside. We know what that is.
Yeah, I wanted to mention to everybody, Victoria's co-writing a children's book with Rian Eisler on, and it's actually the Fogbusters, about, again, this trance, this negative trance that so many of the world is in, that's subpar to our potential, however we would look at it. And so actually what you're saying, Victoria, and certainly Prosocial's goal and was Eleanor Ostrom's goal, is what Diane was talking about. How does this mainstream in consciousness at such a level that it ends up being the common thing for how most of Homo sapiens is motivated? And we've seen 500,000 young men in Russia leave the country instead of going along with that. So we see this dynamism there. But I think exactly what Diane said, and that's what Ken Wilber says, it's not the claims of the religions that are important. It's what they're pointing to toward our behavior. And that's exactly what Prosocial is saying. So if we get caught in the weeds, but we also have to know we're going to get caught in the weeds. We're going to differ about certain things. We're going to differ with regard to certain subsets of data and explanations and all of that I went through. But boy, how we can have that North Star that's about what really counts. You know, I totally agree, Victoria and Diane, and that's what Prosocial is all about. In my
Well, that's the perfect way to end this. And I think we could all feel good. I certainly do, about the big tent that we're offering here. This conversation and all of our conversations is such a big tent that it could contain what took place today, and then every other conversation that takes place. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone, Kurt first and foremost, and everyone else, and then the movable feast continues. Thanks to everyone for all that you're doing.